All right. You know what it is. You know who it is. We're back. Always got to do what would you call
You
that?
have to. It's a hand rub.
Hand rub. Always got to do
I
it.
don't I don't know if we should call it that. I don't know what to call it.
Whatever. It's what I do. It's the BG perform.
That's what it is. That's how
That's
you BG perform.
that's how you start
That's
off.
all.
Just heating up the hands and the mind. We're
Hmm.
back with another episode. So today, well, last week we ended the episode diving into the differences between conditioning, performance, and health conditioning. So I want to do a brief overview of that. And then today we're going to get into a couple of the different specifics like of conditioning of each and what are I guess the common misconceptions or misuses of conditioning that I usually see or that we see inside of training in general. I am in bed, by the way, because that's the only room I have here. So just see this big pillow behind my head.
Sorry, the only room I have is right next to my bed. So
So we're still getting it out. We're still getting it out. But yeah, so last week we dove into conditioning. This week again, like I said, I want to just do a brief overview, mistakes or misuses, and then dive a little bit into some specific conditionings that I use for performance and general health and go from there. So, should we do a clock? I feel like the clock messed it up last time.
I don't know if it's like too much for your computer to do at once or if it's just
Maybe,
your internet because your internet did go out already today.
yeah, so
So
maybe what I'll do is I'll set a timer on my phone.
yeah, let's do it old school for now.
We will do a 30-minute timer here and get as much talking as possible inside
Hmm.
of that 30 minutes. Jerry, are you ready?
Oh, I'm ready.
All right, let's do this. Three, two, one, and boom. All right. So, when we talk about conditioning, obviously last week we dove into the differences inside of performance conditioning and conditioning for health, right? And when we look at those two things, you know, there is clear differences. And I think that oftentimes what happens here is that conditioning for health almost gets misused or not used at all because it's not like hard enough. And then when we talk about conditioning for performance, we end up putting ourselves in a position where we just think sprints are the exact plan or process, right? I just want to find where I was at. Hold on 1 second, because this didn't come up here. Hold on, why is this? Sorry, I had some notes that I wanted to read. I don't know what happened there. That was weird. Okay. So, yeah, when we talk about again conditioning for health, this is going to be repeatable, low intensity, sustainable efforts across like a longer period of time. And this is something that everyone realistically needs to be doing, right? This isn't something that like only people who aren't competing in a sport need to be doing, but this is something that literally every human on earth needs to be doing, right? And the way we defined that last week was conditioning with intent of improving overall capacity or function of the body, aka heart, lungs, blood flow, etc., right? And we look at performance, the definition that we kind of came up with was conditioning with the intent of completing a certain task at the highest physical capacity, right? So that would be I'm completing a 5K, I'm completing a baseball game, a football game, a fight, and I'm trying to do the best that I possibly can inside with my conditioning, right? And those are obviously two different goals. When we're trying to just improve capacity, that level looks a lot different than if we're trying to improve performance overall on a specific task, right? And I think like again, with a lot of our other training philosophies that we have inside of, our programming between me and Jerry is health is always going to be the foundation and everything has to be built upon that. Because if it's not sustainable, right? And then again, this doesn't mean that like you can just do health conditioning and you're gonna be great. The fact of the matter is like you're not going to be able to fully maximize conditioning for performance unless you have a buffer or a base of health conditioning, right? So again, last week we kind of talked a little bit about all of these things and what they include. So, again, low skill, long duration, repeatable, inside of like 30 to 60 minutes would be like the max that I would see in regards to like conditioning for health, right? And once you get over 60 minutes, it's really kind of like it's I wouldn't say it's not health, but it's kind of we're doing it with a purpose, right? Like even for myself, I wouldn't go over 60 minutes unless like today, for example, I was running 12 miles, right? Where it's like I'm gonna be over that 60-minute mark and it's for a goal. Like I'm looking to improve capacity for a specific thing, right? And then also when we talk about conditioning in regards to health, there's generally no rest once you get to that point, right? We should be at a pace that we don't need to stop, and it's an important aspect of determining where we're at inside of the conditioning pieces, right? Even when we get to some performance health goals, performance conditioning goals, there's going to be aspects that don't have rest involved. But for the most part, when we get to some of these tougher, more grueling intervals of work, there's going to need to be rest so we can continue to put out the same intensity, right? So from there, again, we talked about the three differences. So we have the skill, specificity, and threshold training, right? So the skill, as we use, did we talk about the skills from or the differences?
I don't think we dove into that last time. I think
Okay,
we
maybe I
just went
didn't
into
dive in.
like
So
slower pace, faster pace,
yeah,
what
and then
conditioning is.
so then yeah, so I guess maybe I was getting a little bit ahead of myself there, but next we would dive into like well, actually let me take one step back. So with what I just explained for health for condition or conditioning for health, conditioning for performance is going to be a little bit shorter in duration, right? Sometimes it might also be very long in duration. It's really going to be like I shouldn't even say that. I should say it's just specific to the sport, right? That would probably be the best way to describe it.
Yeah, because it'll depend on what you're performing and like what you're training for.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so basically when we talk about conditioning for performance, it's going to be really based around the sport that you're competing, whether it be a run, a bike, a triathlon, a fight, a baseball game, like I'm saying, like all this stuff is going to have different levels of conditioning involved with it, right? So the times are going to be completely different. But they're going to be depending on again the sport, the duration will change, but the intensity is what's going to change, right? So the intensity is what's going to be the biggest difference there. And in regards to what I do usually with the athletes I train are fighters. So the duration is 5 minutes of work, right? Across hopefully 5 rounds. So we get ready for that. So realistically, we're about 25 minutes of work. So no more than like 30 minutes total of conditioning with intense rounds, getting us ready for those outputs of 5 minute rounds and being able to recover, repeat, recover, repeat, recover, repeat, right? So these will tend to have some rest involved with them because again, the intensity is so much higher. So now what I want to do, we'll get into the three main differences inside conditioning for performance and health, right? And there's three main differences that I usually see. One is skill, two is specificity, and three is threshold training, right? So the skill, this changes in a lot of ways, right? Because we can kind of account skill for the movements we do, the capacity at which we do it, the what else would you say skill could involve? Probably the
It could be just like literally training your sport, like just continuing to do that.
yeah. So training your
Yeah.
sport too as well, right? So what I have written down specifically is as we use conditioning for performance, our skill level inside of the conditioning may increase based on the demands of the athlete. We may move away from cyclical modalities, which are basically repeatable things, right? So we're talking bike, we're talking walking, we're talking to a certain extent rowing and skier type things, but usually like bike, walking, running type thing. And there may be more advanced skills and more advanced intervals, right? And what we talk about skill on a level of health conditioning and performance conditioning, health conditioning skill might look like, all right, we're going to go for a 30-minute walk, or we're going to hop on this assault bike and we're going to go for 30 minutes at a sustainable pace. And we're not going to stop the movement the entire time, right? The skill for health for or conditioning for performance might look like, we're having 5 minute rounds with 1 minute of rest in between, and we're doing that for 5 rounds, right? So you can tell as you start to get more involved in some of these pieces, the rest goes down, the intensity goes up, and everything, or the rest gets involved, the intensity goes up, and the output is going to be overall going to be more, right? And that's where we start to see the differences inside of skill, right? Also inside of skill for or conditioning for performance, we might see other modalities such as like carries. There might be different types of movements, and sometimes with MMA, you'll see, fight circuits where they're hitting pads or they're kicking or they're grappling or things like that. Inside of other sports, you might see where it might, they might involve other aspects as well of the sport. And that's where we have to really start to kind of piece together like what is skill and what do we actually need inside of what we're doing. And this is where the skill kind of differentiates from performance for general health or I keep saying this, conditioning for general health and conditioning for performance, right? It's just the actual things you're putting inside of the conditioning and the layout of the program and the design. Anything to add to that?
Just for everyone who's listening to pay attention that pretty much every point he's making is based on like the result you're trying to achieve and the outcome you're trying to achieve. So again, whatever your goal is, it's going to determine or your now I'm messing up.
Yeah.
Whatever your conditioning looks like is going to be determined based on what your goal is.
Yes, of course. Which is perfect because we talk about specificity, right? So specificity, when we look at conditioning, like this is where we start to see the real difference inside of general conditioning for health and then conditioning for performance, right? So we start to see the layout, the structure, the time, all of that stuff start to change, right? And this is where we kind of start to talk about race pace theory, specific time intervals, specific movements, and this is where if you're a fighter, we might throw in some like sprawling and punching type movements. Like I'm not a fan of having the workout look exactly like the fight does, right? Like from my point of view, it's improving the overall capacity of the athlete, not just saying like, oh, he's a fighter, so let's get him tired and have him start punching the wall type thing. Like that's just not to me, that doesn't actually do anything. And they do enough of that inside of the training where they get specific conditioning as well, which we'll talk about. But in terms of specificity, it's like, what are the demands that they need, right? What is a rest period? What are the intervals? What does that stuff look like? And that's where the specificity is so important. That's really one of the main aspects, and that's why it's one of these three that differentiates the two, right? Because inside of general health conditioning, realistically, like it might look like 20 minutes, it might look like 30 minutes, it might be 40, it might be 50, it might be 10, like whatever it is. There is no real like the goal is just to move for as long as you possibly can at a specific pace with nasal breathing and repeatable efforts, right? And in the specificity of the sport, this is where we're going to start to say what is the exact output you need, how are we going to get you better at that output, right? Anything to add to that?
No.
And then we have threshold training. So threshold training is again one of those things that, in my opinion, is the most or one of the most important because it's the amount that you can actually do, right? It's the total amount that you can put out in a specific period of conditioning. And I think that what I have specifically written down is this is the greatest difference in performance, right? Training, the biggest goal is output. Inside our training, the biggest goal is output, especially when we're trying to compete in a sport. So we need to push the limits of our capacity, and we will always be pushing the line on what we are capable of as athletes inside of our conditioning, right? And the two at the top help with threshold training. When the skill is increased and the specificity is increased, then we're able to push the threshold of our conditioning in general, right? Like we're not gonna lose those aspects if both of those things are involved. But even in the same breath, you can have low skill conditioning that pushes threshold, right? And sometimes, what I see is that those lower skill, so for example, right, like for a general health we might look at, say, a 10-minute bike, right? And we might say, you hop on the bike, 10 minutes, nasal breathing, and just kind of move through, right? That same workout can be 10 minutes of max effort calories on the bike, and that could be threshold training, right? And that's pushing the capacity of how much we can actually accomplish inside of 10 minutes. And the 10-minute bike test is something I like to do with a lot of my beginning athletes or beginning people because it's a good test that we can have in the beginning to see where we're at, and we can add to that and then later in the program come back and show the improvements specifically of when you started, right? So let's say you do a 10-minute bike test, you get 70 calories, right? And then you go through the strength program, you go through the conditioning program, through the progression, and then at the end of 3 months, you come back and you hit 85 calories, right? Like that's a really cool thing that someone can come back to and repeat pretty often inside their program and see the results. Because, like, for example, the assault bike isn't just conditioning, right? There's strength aspects involved, there's aerobic aspects involved, there's that anaerobic aspect involved. So there's everything that we're training inside of our program, and it's showing us the continuous improvements that we're going to see inside of that, right? So again, that's skill, specificity, and threshold. And threshold training is essentially finding that top line and trying to get as close as we can to it for as long as we can, and then coming down and resting. And then trying to get a little bit more over, and then coming back down. And it's going to kind of see if you see like real threshold training, and this is one of the problems we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. When you see real threshold training, it's this like up and down. That's like this, right? It's where this line is, and we're slightly going over it each time, slightly going over it and then resting, slightly going over it and resting. And that's how you get better, right? Because you do that enough times, then this starts to go up, and then we're starting the output's a little bit higher, and the output's a little bit higher, and that's how we get better inside of conditioning, right? And performance training is oftentimes, like I said, pushing our limits and demanding the highest return from us inside of our conditioning. And health training is improving the body's capacity in a sustainable framework. So again, if you're trying to get better, just overall healthy, then you don't need to be doing performance conditioning, right? Like you don't need to be touching that threshold. What you need to be doing is trying to make as big and broad a base as possible inside of your conditioning, right? And if you have something you're training for, a specific conditioning session or sport you're trying to compete in, that's when we start to go, okay, where are we at? Let's push it, push it, push it. Let's rest. Push it, push it, push it. Now let's try to raise it. And we just continuously do that over time, right? Anything to add?
Not until we get to like the mistake area,
Cool.
because it's
You
everything you're
guys,
saying is perfect.
yeah, if you guys are inside of the Instagram channel, the Daily Discipline channel, I put two videos in there recently of what aerobic work looks like and what anaerobic work looks like. And you can see the differences in the face, in the breathing, and the speed, and the intensity, and everything, right? So I want you, and these are really cool if you're a coach or you're someone who just wants to kind of understand more about this stuff. Visual representation is really important. It's kind of knowing like what does it look like when someone is in an anaerobic workout or an aerobic workout, right? Because one of the things I've noticed as well, and we're going to get into this now, is there's mistakes inside of programming or well, inside of conditioning where just because like if we go back and what we talked about with the strength programming, right? Just because we're doing a 5 by 5 doesn't mean we're getting stronger, right? There has to be other aspects that help us maximize the 5 by 5. And the power of the 5 by 5 isn't so much the sets and reps, it's the rest and the amount of weight that we can push in that range of reps, right? It's the same thing with conditioning. Just because you're doing 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes doesn't mean you're actually getting what you need out of it, right? If you're just going for 10 minutes and it's a all out blitz for 10 minutes, there's no possible way you're going to be able to maintain 100% output on that, right? It'll probably look like 100% and then it's going to be like 90, 70, 60, 40, right? Like it's going to drop off a cliff. And I think one of the things that we need to understand is inside of conditioning, there's a lot of things that happen where we misuse, right? We misuse either the intensity, we misuse the capacity, or we just misuse it in regards to if we actually need it, right? And I often see that the general population don't do enough of general health conditioning, and athletes go way too hard and they miss the mark, right? And one of my worst ones that I've seen or like, that I've heard is that athletes who go, don't do conditioning all year, they don't do any type of like aerobic work, and they're like, I'll just do bike sprints for 4 weeks and I'll be fine. And it's like, you might get away with that for a little bit. You might get away with that for a while. But then what starts to happen here is like one injury, one missed layoff or session, those sessions become so valuable and you need such high output. And there are studies, right? There are studies that show that anaerobic work does improve your overall capacity, right? But there is, in my eyes, and I don't know this for sure, but mentally in my head, it goes like if you're going 100% and that improves, it's obviously going to improve overall capacity, right? Like if someone goes and does bike sprints for 4 weeks, you're going to get better. But there's going to be a limit on the actual output you can reach or that threshold or that end line because you're not it's almost like you're just kind of it's like you're climbing up a ladder and you're just kind of going up and up and up and up and then eventually it's like the ladder runs out. You know what I mean? Whereas if you build the base and the floor gets higher, then that gets higher along with it. I don't have any like scientific evidence to back that up, but from everything I've done in my coaching career and with the athletes I've worked with, that's kind of been my approach to it is a long base of aerobic training, conditioning, which then helps us build this massive base that we can prop the anaerobic training right on top of and it helps us improve, right? Because realistically, anaerobic training is just helping us deal with lactic acid, that burning feeling that we get into the body and being able to kind of remove that stuff efficiently and buffer it so that we can continue to do work at a high capacity. And when you can do that efficiently, that's when you become a great athlete, right? And especially in fighting, just because obviously that's where I'm at right now in my career with the fight sports, like, you're squeezing and sometimes you're getting pressure and you're not getting enough oxygen in. So that stuff comes and it's a very adrenaline heavy sport. So you'll get this burning factor, right? Like once that initial adrenaline goes away, you'll often see fighters who go doof and they just fall because they don't have real conditioning. They have, 30 or let's say 3 to 5 minutes of like all out war. And then they're like, fuck, I don't actually have any conditioning after that. So they can't sustain it, right? So when we talk about this, like the recommended dose for general population, right, is somewhere between, in my mind, like 30 to 60 minutes, 1 to 2 times a week, right? If you can do that 1 to 2 times a week, whether it be a walk, a bike, a row, a run, something along those lines, you're going to be in great shape, right? And from there, again, this is low skill, repeatable, sustainable efforts, over the course of time that we're kind of progressively improving to make us feel better, right? And I think one of the mistakes that I see with conditioning in general population, and Jerry, I know you said you wanted to add something to this, they try to chase that lactic feeling, that burning feeling, that, like I'm dead after a workout type of feeling. And that just it doesn't help you because one, you're not actually like again, I've seen more people struggle with holding this like a slow, same pace on a bike for 10 minutes more than they would like a Metcon or something like that. If you're not familiar with a Metcon, essentially a Metcon is a workout that involves like a bunch of different movements, like a CrossFit style workout or realistically High Rocks now. Like High Rocks just took what a Metcon is and made it longer and added running, right? So it's that type of workout. Was anything you wanted to add in regards to that?
Yeah, it's pretty much on the same note. Excuse me, on the same note. So like with athletes, the biggest thing that I see, kind of like you said, is they'll be like, "Oh, I'll just do bike sprints." A lot of
It's
athletes will think that
athletes
they,
next. So
well, yeah, I was gonna say a lot of the athletes where you said they'll just do bike sprints for like 4 weeks and be fine. One of the biggest mistakes I see with that is athletes will think that training for their sport is the only conditioning that they need, and they'll just skip out on it, and they'll just be like,
yeah,
"I'll just do the strength stuff. I'm getting my cardio, quote unquote cardio, in my training or in my practice, whatever."
yeah,
But general population, that's exactly what it is.
yeah,
Especially in Denver. There's this thing in Denver where people are always trying to push to the limit because, oh, we're at altitude up here and we want to go to the mountains and be able to really perform up there. And every single gym, I'm not exaggerating, every single gym that I've visited or have coworkers who work at those gyms, every single one misuses intensity by
yeah,
just keeping it high all the time. There's never any slow and controlled stuff. It's always go, 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 high intensity, balls to the wall effort, where at the end everyone was like, "Oh man, I can't breathe. Like I'm gonna feel that tomorrow." And it's like every day. And you see that a lot with like, I won't name the gyms, but a lot of these gyms that are group fitness style gyms, you'll
Yeah.
go in, like we've talked about with strength and conditioning too, there's no progression. It's just a new workout every day, but the intensity never changes. It's always way too high.
Yeah, and I think like the biggest thing for that is obviously like they're throwing a blanket over the problem, right? If you go hard enough, at the end of the day, you're going to feel like you did something and there's going to be some change for a little bit. And that's where a lot of these places make their bread and butter is like they go so hard and they have a little bit of structure into the week and the workouts. And then these people come in, they see some results early on. And then because there is no progression, it drops. And you see these people. I remember at Thrive, I used to have people come from Orange Theory all the time and they were like, oh, yeah, I lost like 60 pounds the first 6 months. And then it's like, now I can't do it. Like, I just haven't lost a single pound since. And it's like,
Hmm.
yeah, that's what happens. You start to see this huge difference, right? You start because your intensity and everything is just going up. And then because there is no actual progression, it's just intensity all the time. Eventually you adapt to that and you're not actually getting better. You just kind of reached your threshold. And when you're at your threshold all the time, eventually, there's not going to be anywhere to go up from there, right? And you need to not go harder. You need to kind of pull back a little bit and just be smarter about the actual training, right? And when we talk about like the because we just went over obviously the conditioning for health, like the for me, the recommended dose for athletes, right, is essentially it obviously depends on the point of the season you're in, right? Because in season is going to be different than off season. And fighting, you're kind of just getting ready year round. And that's why I find the aerobic stuff to be so important because you could have a fight pop up in 2 weeks, right? And you can't be in that high training mode all year round, right? So it's really important that you build an aerobic base or build that base foundation, that foundational base to then build up when the time is necessary, right? But as when we talk about that stuff, like it needs to be based on the point of the season that they're in, as well as the demands of their sport. And I think like off season for me, whatever that might be for the sport is based around that again, that general health conditioning, right? Like if you're not in season, there's no reason to be kind of you know utilizing that type of training yet because it's just going to knock off your recovery, right? And if you learn to actually utilize true aerobic capacity training, repeatable, sustainable efforts, like when the time comes, you're going to maximize your conditioning with the threshold training, right? And in season is going to be based more around high output work that obviously that pushes us past that threshold or past that limit that we have and creates the important adaptations that we need to actually like do the sport, right? And I think that what happens, like we said, is like I see so many mistakes where these athletes are just don't utilize it at all, and then they wonder why they get hurt, and two, they just think like, oh, I'm just going to sprint and I'm just going to get better, and it like again, it does, right? It does work for a little bit, and you get into these bad habits. It's the same thing as nutrition, like you see people who want to lose weight and then they just do these crazy diets and then they wonder why in 6 months it's like, oh, I'm tired, I can't sleep, like I'm starving all the time and I'm not losing weight. And it's like, well, I wonder why, because you have like no understanding of actual nutrition. You just basically sprinted in the forms of nutrition that someone would on conditioning, right?
Hmm.
Essentially what happens is like these athletes, they do too much too late before the season, and then they kind of rush everything into like this short term, like, super conditioning period. And then, that's it. And you see these people who in the off season, they either, they gain a bunch of weight or they just kind of struggle with all of it, you know? But yeah, so those are the two biggest things. Anything to add to that?
No, no, that's good.
Well, and I think the last thing I want to talk about is, you know, with those mistakes being talked about, right? So we talked about the differences. We talked about the three main uh, pieces of each, and then we talked about the mistakes, right? So now what I want to talk to you about is how would I actually take conditioning and build it into like a program, right? Because this is an important piece, and especially like if you only have 2 days of training a week, obviously, I would say if you can do these sessions by themselves during the week, that would be great, right? If you can add 2 days of lifting along with 2 days of like aerobic capacity for general training, that is like perfect. If you can go walk, bike, run, whatever it is for 30 to 60 minutes, that would be amazing. But either most people don't have the time or they don't have the capacity and they just want to do it all in one go, which is great. So what I want to talk about a little bit is how we can stack the training on top of each other. And this goes for both, right? This goes for general health and this also goes for the performance conditioning because this is another thing as well where I think people struggle with doing everything, right? So when I put out a program, this is how I usually lay things out. So we'll have high skill work first, and high skill meaning just like stuff that causes or needs a lot of mental focus and like CNS uh, output, right? So we're talking about plyometrics, which are like jumps, hops, skips, that type of thing. Ballistics, which are like throws and slams, or learning a new movement pattern, gymnastics, snatching, cleaning, something like that, something that's really high skill on the body. And then this can also be like a back squat, a deadlift, something like if you're learning a new skill and you need all your focus, that should be one of the first things that you do, right? And this primes the body, this gets you ready, and this also gives you like when you're at your best energy and mental clarity to do this. This timer's about to run out, so I'm just gonna hit this quick. We'll just go over. Um, then from there, we have high output. So high output is going to be obviously like we've talked about in the past. So this is traditional strength movements. This is traditional, um, what do we want to call it? This is traditional, like for example, if we're back squatting, right? And we look at the back squat as a whole, right? The next movement that might support that would be like a leg press, right? Where the leg press is where we're taking away all the skill that's really involved inside of the back squat, which would be thoracic extension, core strength, anything else. What else? Knee flexion, ankle mobility, all this different stuff that might get in the way of us actually completing the skill itself, and we're taking that all away so we can maximize strength output, right? And we've talked about this before with the conditioning, but just kind of giving you an overview. So high skill, high output. Then we have low skills like accessory pieces. So these are going to be things where accessory work that doesn't require a lot of mental focus or clarity, but we can still have like high output on, right? So this is where we would talk about that 3 by 8 to 10, 3 by 8 to 12, 2 by 20, those types of reps and sets, right? And then after that, we can have some type of maybe like core work, or we get right into the aerobic work or the anaerobic work, right? If we're kind of laying this out in a shorter term, it'd be high skill, high output, low skill, aerobic, and anaerobic work, right? And there's some people who like to do both, where it'd be actual like aerobic work and then anaerobic work in the same session. You always want to kind of save the anaerobic work for last because that's again threshold, right? So that's where we're kind of fatiguing ourselves to the point that we're getting all of that out. Obviously, ideally we wouldn't want to do all of that in one session because we're probably not going to be able to maximize all of it. That's where we kind of like spread this out throughout the week and have our strength sessions and then aerobic session and an anaerobic session, especially for an athlete. I think it's really important in someone like, for example, with fighting, you're not just doing strength conditioning, right? You're doing jujitsu, wrestling, boxing, Muay Thai, and sparring, right? It was essentially as a fight. So it's like you have all of those things you have to train throughout the week, and then you have to add on the strength conditioning on top of that. So that's where we start to look at it. It's like a strength training session after sparring, great idea, right? Jujitsu and a lift, great idea. Pads and conditioning, great idea, right? Like those are how you kind of would start to stack this, and we can talk about that in a different episode. But we'd want to kind of spread it out throughout the week where we're not doing all of it in one session because I've worked with athletes where I've only had 2 days a week with them, and you're doing everything, right? You have to literally do every single thing inside of a session, and it's just they leave dead, and like you're not getting anything out of it because they're tired from training, and then you're asking them to squat heavy, do jumps, do accessory work, and do conditioning in an hour. It's like, it's impossible to actually get everything you need done inside of that session. So, if we lay it out in that fashion, this is going to give us the necessary energy and capacity to get everything done, obviously inside of a regular session, but it's ideal if we can split that up across the week, right? And for performance, I often, like I said, I think that it's crucial to do that because if you want to maximize your strength, you can't do it on the same day that you're doing a bunch of conditioning, right? And if you and let's say you do, if you do maximize your strength, you're probably not going to be able to maximize your conditioning, right? And if you at least focus on a day to get stronger, focus on a day to get fitter, focus on a day to get more condition, focus on a day to get healthier, that type of thing, you're gonna be better off, right? And especially when we're throwing in these different modalities, it's like we have to be smart about the training. Otherwise, we're gonna be kind of lost, right? And we're not gonna find what we need out of training, and then we're not gonna be good, you know? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, so obviously, geez, dude, I can't clear my throat today.
Yeah.
Obviously, some people won't be able to, like, based on their schedule, if you are doing, like, let's say boxing, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, sparring, all that stuff on top of your conditioning, on top of your strength and conditioning, some days you might have to do your conditioning on the same day as your strength. If that's the case, one of the best things you could do is to, whichever one you do first, depending on what your schedule is to complete one session, get some full recovery, full rest, food in between, and then later on do the other session. This way, you at least get some time to recover so you can train each to their relatively, what's the word I'm looking for? Um,
Like capacity?
yeah, to the relative capacity that you're trying to accomplish. You won't be dead from one or the other. You can give full rest and recovery with a meal in between. This way, you could actually get something out of it.
Yeah, and I think like so actually I want to say one thing too. Like with the athletes that I work with, especially Ian, because I'm with him year round, one of the things that I do with Ian is I try to compact the training as much as I can, right? So what I try to do with him is in the beginning before like an MMA session, we do a warm up. So about 15-minute warm up. That's what we do, all the plyometrics, the stretches, the specific mobility routines, that type of thing. Then he gets into his training, whether it be jujitsu, sparring, MMA, whatever it might be. And then after that, as soon as possible, especially on like the sparring days, we lift, right? Because the way that I look at it is if you compact everything into that short piece, you're maximizing the rest of your day to actually recover. The thing I don't like about splitting up the training sessions, but and this is fine too. Like you can do what Jerry just said. The one thing I'm saying in opposition to that is the one thing that I see is if you work out at 9 a.m. and then you work out at say 7 p.m., right? You're limiting your recovery in regards to how much you actually get to recover, right? So you're limiting how much you actually get to rest in your day because it's like you're spiking your CNS in your body, and then you're bringing it back down throughout the day, and then you're spiking it again, and then you're bringing it back down, and then shortly after, so say you go 9 a.m. every single day, you go 9 and 7, then it's like you get just about, a little over 12 hours, when in reality, if you stack that training a little bit more compact, you get 24 hours of recovery, right? Just a thought, an idea. I've done it with Ian. It's worked out pretty well. I think again, and what Jerry said, the benefit is you get to maximize each, right? But I think with in fight sports, overall strength isn't that big of a like it's important, but it's like absolute strength, it's more relative strength, right? Like how much strength do you actually need to be good at MMA? It's up for debate because you see these jacked guys who get their ass kicked, right? And you see the skinnier guys like Ian who are doing all the ass kicking, right? So it's just like how much strength do you actually need? And that's where those strength sessions might be a little bit more important. For the conditioning, I think that like if you can focus on giving them a little bit more of their own capacity or their own time, that's better because then you can actually maximize it like Jerry's talking about. But I think that also recovery is one of the most important things overall. And if you can maximize recovery and compact everything inside of, say a 2 hour session, that might be, to me, that's worked out pretty well, right? But yeah, I mean, like realistically, I think both of those things work depending on your schedule and how you feel. Some people like to rest. Some people, like Ian on occasion does like to rest. Sometimes we go right after it if he's feeling good. Just kind of depends, right? But I think that's it on that. I think that the only other thing that I got to figure out, I want to send to people who listen to the podcast, I want to send them examples of conditioning. I guess if you guys do follow me, you probably follow me on Instagram and you're probably in the channel. So join in the channel. I put in a couple different conditioning pieces. I put in what a nice like aerobic session might look like. For example, 3 minutes on the bike, 1 minute off times like 6 to 8 rounds. You can do the bike, ski, run, or row. That's going to be something where it's sustainable. We're working on nasal breathing, that type of thing, right? And then if you look at like a specific performance workout, we're looking at like 5 rounds on the assault bike, 2 minutes at a specific RPM, which is about, on this workout that I put was 60% of the person's overall max, then 2 minutes at 65%, and then 1 minute at 70%, right? So you're filling out 5 minutes of work, but the intensity is increasing and there's specifics, there's output, there's threshold in that. And that's what the difference is. But basically, I want you guys to see one, like when you're actually looking at someone who does it, what does it look like, right? What do their body language look like? What does their face look like? What does their breathing look like? That type of thing, right? And then inside the actual conditioning pieces, what does the language look like? What does the rest times look like? The rounds, the specific percentages, the intensity, the instructions, that type of thing. Because that all matters as well. And I think that, like, with these types of things, you'll be able to really see what it's like to do true aerobic work and then true performance work, right? Because they're different. But yeah, I think go onto the channel, check that out. And if you guys have any specific questions or you want to see that, you can obviously just let us know and we'll send you or explain that a little bit more. Yeah, anything to add to that? I
That's good.
think we covered a lot there. And I think, yeah, I think it should give you a good idea on how to deal with conditioning for health and conditioning for performance. But if you guys do have any questions, let us know. And we'll see you guys next time. Peace.